What if a simple good morning text is the reason someone can't stop thinking about you all day? Not because of love, but because of psychology. There are messages that feel normal, and then there are forbidden morning texts that silently take over the mind. And today, you're going to understand the difference. Most people send good morning and get forgotten in seconds, but a few carefully structured lines, they don't just get read, they echo. They come back during coffee breaks, during silence, and even before sleep. The difference is not effort, it's psychology. The first type, the unfinished thought message, works because the human mind naturally dislikes incomplete information. When something feels open ended, the brain doesn't simply ignore it, it keeps returning to it in the background, almost like a quiet mental reminder that hasn't been resolved yet.
Thoughtful. This is not about manipulation, but about how attention naturally behaves when curiosity is triggered without closure. When a message suggests there was a thought but doesn't fully reveal it, it creates a small gap in understanding. That gap becomes active in the mind. Instead of treating it as something finished, the brain tries to complete it on its own. Throughout the day, even during unrelated activities, that unfinished idea can resurface again and again without effort. What makes this even more impactful is timing. Mornings are a mentally open state where thoughts are not yet overloaded with daily noise. So when an incomplete idea enters at that stage, it gets more mental space than it would later in the day. It doesn't feel heavy or forced, but it quietly settles in the background. There is also a subtle emotional layer to it. Because the message doesn't give everything away, it naturally creates curiosity rather than pressure. The mind starts wondering what the thought was, why it was held back, and whether it had any personal meaning behind it. This reflection happens automatically without conscious effort. Over time, this kind of message doesn't just stay as words. It turns into a repeated mental return point. Not because it demands attention, but because the brain itself keeps reopening it, trying to complete what was left unfinished. The second type, the soft attention shift message, works because it gently redirects focus without asking for anything in return. It doesn't try to impress or demand a response. Instead, it introduces a subtle observation that feels personal but not intrusive. That balance is important because the mind tends to engage more deeply with things that feel natural rather than forced. When a message says something like, "Something feels different lately," it doesn't point to a clear explanation. It simply acknowledges a shift. The mind then naturally starts searching for what that shift could be. This is how attention gets activated. Not through intensity, but through quiet uncertainty that feels meaningful enough to reflect on. What makes it interesting is that it doesn't define the emotion completely. It leaves space for interpretation. In human psychology, especially in emotional perception, people tend to fill in gaps based on their own feelings and experiences. So the message becomes slightly personal in the way it is understood. Even if it was originally general, there is also a grounding effect in it. Because it doesn't carry pressure or expectation, it feels light to receive. But at the same time, it still registers in the mind because it feels thoughtful. That combination of lightness and subtle depth is what allows it to stay in memory longer than a direct or obvious message would. Throughout the day, the mind may return to it without noticing, not because it is urgent, but because it creates a quiet curiosity. It doesn't give a conclusion, so the brain keeps revisiting it in the background, trying to make sense of the feeling it introduced. The third type, the silent compliment message, works in a very different way from direct praise. Instead of clearly stating admiration in a loud or obvious form, it expresses recognition in a calm and understated way. This makes it feel more natural, almost like something that wasn't carefully crafted, but simply observed and shared. Because of that, It doesn't create pressure or expectation in the moment it is received. What makes this approach interesting is that it doesn't push for validation or response. It simply places a thoughtful observation into someone's mind and then leaves it there. When a person reads something like this, the brain doesn't treat it as a demand. Instead, it treats it as information worth reflecting on. That reflection often continues quietly in the background throughout the day. Human psychology responds strongly to feeling noticed in a specific and subtle way. Not in a general or exaggerated sense, but in a way that feels personal and carefully observed. When a message hints at that kind of awareness, it creates a sense of being seen without needing explanation. This can make the thought linger longer than expected. Another reason this type stays in the mind is because it avoids over-explaining. There is no attempt to justify the compliment or make it heavy. It is simply stated and left open. That simplicity allows the mind to interpret it in its own way, which naturally increases internal engagement. As the day continues, the message can resurface in small moments, not because it demands attention, but because it created a quiet impression. It feels less like something to react to and more like something to think about, which is why it tends to stay present in memory longer than more direct expressions. The fourth type, the imagery trigger message, works because the human brain naturally remembers pictures more strongly than plain words. When a message creates a visual scene in the mind, it becomes easier to hold onto. Instead of just reading information, the mind starts experiencing it in a subtle way, almost like briefly stepping into that moment. When something like a calm morning scene or soft light is described, it doesn't feel like instruction or conversation. It feels like a small mental picture forming on its own. This is important because the brain processes imagery differently from direct statements. It doesn't just store it as text, it stores it as an experience. That's why it tends to return later in unexpected moments. There is also a calming effect in these types of messages, because they are not demanding attention or asking for anything. They feel light and easy to absorb. At the same time, the imagery adds emotional tone without needing explanation. A simple scene can carry warmth, quietness, or comfort without directly saying those things. What makes it stay longer in memory is how the mind replays images throughout the day. While doing unrelated tasks, small triggers can bring that scene back for a second. It might not even be a full memory, just a feeling or a visual fragment. But that brief return is enough to keep it active in thought. Over time, these kinds of messages don't feel like normal text anymore. They feel like small moments that were experienced internally. And because the brain naturally revisits visual impressions, the message continues to exist in the background in a soft and unforced way. The fifth type, the unexpected presence message, works because it introduces a feeling rather than a direct statement. It doesn't explain anything clearly, and that lack of explanation is exactly what makes the mind pay attention to it. When something feels slightly unusual or out of pattern, the brain naturally tries to understand why it feels that way. When a message suggests a shift in how mornings feel, it creates a subtle association. The mind starts linking a normal routine with a new emotional layer. Even though nothing physically changes, the perception of the routine begins to include that thought in the background. This is how simple associations form over time. What makes this type effective is its gentle tone. It doesn't try to define emotions too strongly, and it doesn't push for a reaction. Instead, it simply places an observation that feels slightly reflective. Because it is not demanding attention, it slips into the mind without resistance, which allows it to stay longer. Human psychology often gives more importance to things that feel slightly different from the usual pattern. When a familiar part of the day suddenly feels noticed or emotionally marked, even in a small way, it creates awareness. That awareness is what keeps the message alive internally throughout the day. As time passes, the thought may resurface in quiet moments, not because it is important in a logical sense, but because it changed how something familiar is perceived. The mind doesn't treat it as a single message anymore. It starts to blend it with routine experience, which is why it can quietly remain present without needing repetition or effort. The sixth type, the soft mystery message, works because the human mind is naturally drawn to incomplete explanations. When something is hinted at but not fully revealed, it creates a mental space that feels unfinished. The brain doesn't like leaving things unresolved, so it keeps returning to it in the background, trying to make sense of what is missing. When a message suggests there is something interesting but chooses not to fully share it, it immediately creates curiosity. This curiosity is not forced. It happens automatically because the mind starts building possible meanings on its own. Even if the message itself is simple, the lack of full clarity makes it feel more engaging than something fully explained. The seventh type, the emotional echo message, works because it carries a sense of calm intention without asking for anything in return. It feels simple on the surface, but the way it lands in the mind is what gives it weight. When a message shows up without a reason, the brain naturally tries to assign meaning to it, even if there isn't a clear one stated. What makes this type different is the absence of pressure. There is no request, no expectation, and no direction. That lack of demand creates a kind of emotional ease. The mind doesn't feel pushed to respond immediately, so it processes the message more freely. And when something is processed without pressure, it often stays longer in memory. There is also a subtle emotional comfort in it. A message that feels like it was shared just to add a calm moment can create a quiet pause in the middle of a busy day. Even if that pause is small, it can stand out because most communication in daily life tends to be task-driven or reactive. This difference makes it more noticeable in hindsight. Human psychology often gives more attention to things that feel unexpected but gentle. When something arrives without a clear reason, the mind tends to revisit it later and try to understand the intention behind it. That reflection doesn't always lead to an answer, but the process itself keeps the thought active in the background.